You're listening to the Bear in Mind Podcast, episode number 40.
A podcast uncovering identity, color, and love, where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Bias.
I can't believe it's episode number 40. It's another love episode. And if you've listened to the past love episodes, you get the idea. And every 10 episodes, I talk about something that I didn't appreciate before and now I love today. And it also goes with the tagline of the podcast. It's one of the taglines is love without limit. It's actually to really come from a place of love, and there's actually no limit on the potential to love everything and everyone in this world. And some days that's a challenge. And so we're going to start a little something a little easier. And so this episode is about comedians and why I love them today. So a little backstory. I actually didn't hate comedians. I think I've always liked comedians. Most of us love to laugh, and I've always kind of appreciated watching comedy shows. When I was a teenager, I loved shows like The Tonight Show, kind of the late night shows, and they're always kind of my guilty pleasure. And today they still are. And my favorite comedy show is actually the Graham Norton Show in the UK. But I recently came into understanding more about being a comedian, being a particular stand-up comedian. I also recently read a memoir by the comedian Trevor Noah. And I've listened to a lot of interviews with comedians because they're usually, going to be funny. And so I've learned a lot of things about actually becoming a comedian, which is kind of fascinating. And so I kind of want to highlight 3 parts of actually being a comedian and why I appreciate them today. And the number one thing that I learned is that all comedy is based on perspective. It may seem obvious that comedy is based on perspective, and it plays on perspective, because if you ever notice, comedy in one country won't translate into another country, into another culture. So really good comedians need to really understand the perspective of their audiences, and this is often why you may not like a certain comedian, even if it's in your own language, in your own culture. You might not like a certain comedian because they're speaking to someone with a certain type of perspective. And the key difference with comedy is that it tries to subtly switch your perspective. Almost every joke, if you look at it, is to take something that we all see every day and then look at it in another way, and then present it in a way that is funny to the audience. But what is happening in the essence of a joke is actually switching the perspective of the audience, of an everyday perspective that everyone sees something. And that's why we don't like some comedians, because when they switch that perspective, we don't like being faced with that perspective that they're showing us. And so then we don't laugh. And that's why I actually really appreciate comedy, because while I'm having fun, while I'm laughing, I'm also a little bit learning something. I'm learning how to look at a situation in a different way. And it's something that was brought out actually in Trevor Noah's memoir, Born a Crime, where he shows you a different perspective of life. He shows you a different life in which he grew up in. And he does it in a fun way. And that's something I really appreciate. How often can somebody really show you a different perspective from the one that you've so ingrained in your mind about viewing the world a certain way, and then the ability to show you something contrary to what you think and believe, and you're laughing while you're doing it. And so how do comedians do this? And I actually found my answer. It's because they know how to listen. And listening is one of those skills that I think is so misunderstood in our world. We think it's staying quiet, nodding your head, saying uh-huh, and looking the person in the eye and things like that, or turning off your phone, and all of these things to show that you're actually listening, when in fact you're not really listening. You're just trying to show to the other person that you are listening. And one of the things about listening is you actually have to clear your mind. And our mind has about, and the numbers vary, like 40,000 to 60,000 thoughts that are running in our head. A lot of those thoughts are when somebody else is speaking, you're thinking about stuff that you need to do, or you're judging the other person, or you're daydreaming about something, that a goal you want or something like that. And so our head gets distracted. And so then we're not really listening to what the person is saying. And a comedian really needs to do this. They need to actually listen to the perspective of the people that they're trying to make laugh. And that is something so fascinating that I learned. I actually learned this. I read this based on a study in a book by You're Not. It's the title of the book is You're Not Listening, where if you want to be funny in your group of friends or something that, or, have a good sense of humor, the key to that is to actually clear your mind and listen to somebody else's perspective. And it may seem really like, what? How do you do that? And I have been working actually on my listening skills, really clearing my head of my judgments of people when they tell me their story, or thinking about my grocery list or something like that, and really clearing my head. And I sometimes have a hard time doing this, especially if you're tired or hungry or all of those things. But in one particular social group of mine, I go in with kind of this negative perspective because I've had a lot of negative experiences, how I see it as negative experiences with this group. And so I was working on my listening skills. So okay, I'll go to the group and I'll try to listen more to them. And I showed up and I cleared my head of all of my usual judgments. And I showed up and I was actually able to listen and then say things where other people laughed at what I was saying. And I realized, I'm not a funny person. I'm not, this podcast is not a comedic podcast. And when I was able to listen, I found that I could show up with a sense of humor about stuff and not take everything that everyone said so personally. And that's something that I've learned a lot from comedians, reading about their stories and hearing their interviews, is you can actually see that they actually have to pay attention to people in a conversation, in an interview, or, when they're on the late show, like the Graham Norton show and stuff like that, that they need to actually hear the other person. And the last thing that I've learned is not to take myself so seriously. I used to go to this comedy club in my city where up-and-coming stand-up comedians, they would do a show. It was in a really small venue. And since it was in a small venue, he could really see everybody in the audience. And some of the stand-up comedians have the style of talking to the audience and asking them questions and then poking fun at the audience members. And I'd always kind of take the back seat. My friends and I would sit in the back because we didn't want to get picked on. But when some comedians would do this and talk to the audience, I noticed that people would laugh. They were making fun of the people in the group, and I was laughing at them. And then it got me thinking, what if a comedian were to pick on me? Could I laugh along with that, with what they were saying about me, what they were making fun of, if they were making fun of me or whatever? And I slowly started to learn as I watched comedy like this, especially a live stand-up show, is that you can't really take yourself so seriously. And it kind of was like, yeah, okay, so what if somebody thinks that about you? You kind of let go of that, especially when you see a comedian that's kind of making fun of you and giving you a different perspective on yourself. And it may not be something that you want to see and hear about yourself. But if you don't take yourself seriously and you're like, okay, whatever, you can then join in the laughter. And it's at nobody's expense then. And I'm wrapping it up here, and I highly recommend that you check out all the love episodes, number 10, 20, 30, and now 40. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime. Comfort provides a floor, but also a ceiling. I'll check back with you next week.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.